When I wrote the first edition of my best-selling book, How to Grow a Multi-Million-Dollar Property Portfolio in Your Spare Time, way back in 2006, it was far outsold by a book by another prominent property author that promised the secret to going from 0 to 230 properties in 3.5 years. Subsequently, the same author wrote another updated book, 0 to 260 properties in 7 years. Now, who would want to be able to achieve that? But the question is it realistic? Of course, the answer is no. And the author didn't own that number of properties either. He was using a form of options that's now illegal. Now, I'm not suggesting at the time he did anything illegal. Not at all. Anyway, there are still people out there claiming you can build significant property portfolios in a short period of time. 10 properties in 10 years or 7 properties in 7 minutes. Really? Well, my guest today, Daniel Gold, who's a finance broker, explains why owning 50 properties is virtually impossible today. Now, I'm sure you're going to enjoy my chat with him, but before you do, let's put some context to this. Clearly, it's not how many properties you own that's important. More important is the size of your asset base and how hard your money's working for you. I've often said I'd rather own one Westfield shopping centre, and even today, despite all the problems that shopping centres are having with COVID, I'd rather own one shopping centre than 50 properties in regional Australia. Well, when we dug into the latest Australian Tax Office data showing how many property investors there are in Australia and how many properties they own, the statistics were telling. 73% of property investors in Australia only owned one property, and close to 18% owned 2 properties. In other words, around 90% of property investors in Australia never get past their first or second property, and less than 1% of all property investors, that's just over 20,000 Australians or families or trusts, owned 6 or more properties. That's it. Oh, by the way, my fellow director Kate Forbes, when she dug into these figures, recognised that our clients at Metropole outperform these averages by 3 to 5 times. Having said that, it's still really hard to grow a portfolio of 50 properties, as you're going to hear in my conversation today with Dan Gold. And then, as always, I'm going to share a mindset message with you. So welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment, and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect, and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now, here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
How many investment properties do you want to own? Maybe a better question is, how many properties will you be able to accumulate over the years? Now, I know there's some people out there suggesting that if you own 1 or 2 properties, that's enough. If you want more, you're greedy. On the other hand, I keep getting emails in my inbox saying how I can amass a significant property portfolio almost overnight. You know what I mean? 7 properties in 7 years or 10 properties in 10 minutes. Well, what's realistic in today's changed lending environment? Recently, we published a blog by finance broker Daniel Gold on Property Update called "Sorry, Owning 50 Properties is Near Impossible Now." And boy, was it a hit. It had over 10,000 people read that blog in the first day alone. So I thought I'd ask Daniel about his inspiration for that blog. Welcome, Daniel.
G'day, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Now, for those who don't know Daniel, he's the director of Long Property and an investment-savvy finance broker, and he specialises in residential real estate. But I'm also impressed because he's a rising star in the industry, having been recognised as one of the top 30 brokers under the age of 35. So, Daniel, great topic. Obviously, good clickbait headline, but it had a message to it. There was some depth to it. What was your thought process when writing this blog?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Well, really just the thought came about because it was a question that got asked of myself by a client who was a young professional and, credit to his ambition. He really wanted to get started on building a large property investment portfolio. And he specifically referenced this book, which, talking about clickbait headlines, certainly has one itself. 0 to 260 plus properties in 7 years by Steve McKnight. And he said, Dan, that's what I want to do. How do I do it? So, it just led to a good discussion. And I think there are a couple of points which might be useful to a broader audience. I just thought I'd share it.
Well, look, I know you're ambitious and I know you don't want to hold back any of your clients' ambitions either, but I think part of your job as a professional and ours is also to stop people making mistakes. So was that relevant almost a decade ago when that book was first written, or the first version of that, which was slightly different? It was actually talking about a different form of finance strategy that's not available today. And it wasn't the normal buy and hold, but it was a form of vendor finance that got some popularity and then was actually made illegal, if I'm not mistaken. So let's go back to the concept, how many properties can you own? And it's a sort of trick question. It doesn't really matter how many properties you've got. It really just depends upon how big your asset base is and how well your portfolio is performing. But there's another philosophy behind this too, isn't there? Are you chasing capital growth or are you chasing cash flow? Over the decade since the global financial crisis, it's been much harder to get finance. Well, that's what I've noticed. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a completely different credit environment that we're operating in now in comparison to, say, 10 years ago when that book that we're talking about was first published. And I think some listeners might be familiar with the National Consumer Credit Code, or National Consumer Credit Protection Act 2009, which is really just legislation designed to protect consumers in the finance industry. Basically, all lenders and mortgage brokers are required to adhere to these sets of rules. And they're relatively new rules. Like I said, they never existed earlier. So I suppose, if you like, Michael, I can just elaborate on what these new rules are all about and what it means in the context of that, budding property investor that wants to build the portfolio.
I think it's worth going into the detail. What I've noticed, though, over that decade is the end result of them is it's much harder for beginners to get their first deposit, partly at the moment because where they put their money, the interest that they can get while they're saving up is harder. It seems much harder to get to your second and third and fourth property. It was much easier in the old days to get loans. And then it's even much harder to live off the equity of your properties and the cash flow from your properties. So it has had multiple ramifications, Daniel. So yes, I would like to get into a bit more detail, please.
Yep, absolutely. So, so many things to unpack there, but let's just focus on the ones specifically related to lending and borrowing capacities, because that's definitely one that we get asked a lot about in our mortgage broking business and dictates so much of what's possible. One useful illustration of how these rules differ is really just kind of taking an investment property, call it an investment property that's generating $500 a week in rental income, and just working through some of the specifics as it relates to a borrowing capacity calculation that the bank might do to determine how much more money they might be able to extend to a client, right? So,
okay, let's work through it.
Let's work through it. You've got the investment property, which, like I said, is generating $500 per week in rental income. And let's say that there's some debt against that property that's costing the borrower $500 per week in interest expenses. So back in the old days, prior to this NCCP legislation that I mentioned earlier, a bank might look at that scenario and ultimately just realize that the rental income negates the interest expense, and therefore the combined result is that might have a nil impact on somebody's borrowing capacity. Or another way to say it might be that particular investment property is washing its own face. It's taking care of itself. And there's ultimately no underlying obligation that the client has to put in much of his or her own money. So obviously what that meant is that any client that held one or two or three or larger numbers of those types of properties could keep building their portfolio, because every new one they took on was not hindering how much money they could borrow from the bank, assuming, of course, that they also had like you said, the capital to pay deposits and whatnot. But in the new world, with this NCCP regulation, it's very different. And it really comes down to how the banks are assessing the rental income and also how they're assessing those same expenses associated with the investment property, which, just fast forwarding a few steps, ultimately do start limiting the amount of additional debt that people can take on to build their portfolios. So would you like me to kind of go into a bit further detail then, Michael, about what I'm referencing?
Sure, because in the old days, they didn't look at other outgoings. It was much easier. So I know they look at it much more carefully now. So let's go into that detail. I know it is detail, but I think our listeners need to understand this because they're getting frustrated. They're getting frustrated by the extra paperwork, but also by the hold up when we refer clients to you and they say, but hey, I've got this equity. I've actually got a little bit of positive cash flow. Why won't the banks lend me more? So I think this is going to answer those questions.
Absolutely. And I do realize in the podcast format, it can be a little bit difficult to follow the numbers, but I'll keep the example as easy as we can, and it couldn't be too difficult. So,
well, may I also suggest I'm going to link to your great article, your great blog. So if people just want to listen in, don't pay too much attention if it's too hard, and you can look at the numbers afterwards.
Absolutely. So it is all in the blog post as well, and I think that's a great idea. Let's just unpack the income side and the expense side in a bit more detail. I mentioned that the rental income of the property might be $500 per week, but rather than giving the borrower credit for $500 per week, under the new rules, the bank is effectively having to sensitize that rental income. And typically, most banks are reducing the rental income by about 20 or 30%. So, for example, if we just reduce that rental income by 25%, the midpoint, all of a sudden the $500 per week of rental income gets whittled down to about $375 of rental income per week that the bank's giving you credit for. Okay? And then on the expense side, unfortunately, it gets a hell of a lot worse. So rather than only looking at the $500 per week of gross interest expense, they go a lot further. If that $500 per week of interest expense was just an interest-only repayment, for example, the bank basically disregards the fact that the borrower is only paying interest, and they pretend that the commitment is actually on principal and interest repayment terms instead of interest only. And as most of your listeners, obviously, Michael, would know, the overall repayments in a P&I or principal and interest scenario are much greater than if you're just paying interest because you're paying principal as well as interest. So that's a key factor. The other one is that there are obviously costs involved associated with running an investment property. For example, a property manager, insurance, repairs and maintenance, council rates, water and sewer costs, and so on and so forth. So the banks are now actually asking the borrowers to estimate what those costs are for each one of their investment properties, and then they're factoring that into their calculation too. And Michael, if you didn't think it could get any worse, there's a third factor, and that is that whatever the actual interest rate that the borrower is paying might be, the banks are actually, we say, buffering up that interest rate to further de-risk the lend from their perspective. So whilst a borrower's interest rate might be 3%, the banks are going to run their calculations on 5.5%, some 2.5% more than the actual rate.
So what all that means is that while in the old days they said, oh, look, it sort of breaks even, I'll lend you more money, today they suggest that you're quite cash flow negative. And in all honesty, that's true because there are vacancy periods, there are real costs. I guess the reason behind this is some people were lent a bit too much money. They got a bit ahead of themselves and got themselves into financial trouble, didn't they, Daniel?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there were cases of that, and you can definitely see the merit of some of the legislation. I mean, it's obviously, we could debate for a long time whether they've gone too far now, perhaps. but there's no question it's a lot more difficult than it has been. And I must say, that assessment rate that I just mentioned, which is often 2.5% more than what the borrower is actually paying, that used to be 7.25 or 7.5% only about 6 or 7 months ago. So this is a fast-changing kind of space in the whole lending world, and it's definitely worth keeping a close eye on.
So what it's suggesting is you need more cash flow to hold onto your properties or to get serviceability for future properties than you did in the old days. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. But I also think, Michael, there's a little bit more to it, because what we've just spoken about is, broadly speaking, how the bulk of the lenders are currently operating in today's market. However, there are many lenders out there, and all of them do interpret the NCCP legislation in different ways. And also, a lot of banks do have their own credit policies which differ from one another. So, a lot of what we've just spoken about there are, broad-based principles and maybe some averages. But, it definitely speaks to the benefit of possibly canvassing some more options beyond just maybe the one or two banks that you're most familiar with or you've used in the past, because there can be, other lending options that might unlock some further borrowing capacity for a particular client in a given scenario.
Now, one of the things a bank won't tell you is that the other bank down the road with the yellow logo rather than the blue logo is going to lend you more money. So I'm not suggesting that the bank with the yellow logo does lend more money, but they won't tell you their restrictions or the way that they look at things. And that's why I really think it's important to have a finance strategist as part of your team to work through the maze. I'm glad it's not a part of the business that I'm particularly in, because I don't envy the extra work you and your team have to do now just to get a deal across the line. But if you understand the rules of the game, then you just have to play by the rules. What that seems to mean, though, is that it's not as easy to amass as large a portfolio, and having positively geared properties really doesn't seem to have any real benefit, does it?
Well, I think the key point here, Michael, is that right now, everybody really has got a debt ceiling. And that's the key point that I wanted to try and emphasize in the article that I wrote. Whereas in the old days, amassing all these additional properties, as we've just discussed, you could really keep going much more freely. But right now, even if you do have a cash flow neutral or a cash flow positive investment property, it is likely going to be hindering any additional borrowing capacity in some way, shape, or form. So just this concept of a debt ceiling is important to appreciate. And I think what it means is really there is an opportunity cost associated with taking on any new debt. And how many times, Michael, would you have been in strategy sessions with, either your own clients or other clients in any one of your businesses, and you're looking at assets which might just be, looking after themselves, but that might be preventing the borrower from buying a better quality asset that could potentially take them closer towards their, realizing their financial objectives.
You're right. In other words, your opportunity cost is one of the big issues. So people often say to us, it's not costing me anything, but you have a debt ceiling, your money's going to run out before the opportunities. So if you can only own 2 or 3 properties, or forget how many properties, but a certain dollar value of properties, you should really own the best you can. Now, interestingly, we just had a quick chat before we started pressing the record button about an article that appeared on realestate.com yesterday, and it was a story about a 28-year-old whiz kid who has bought 6 properties since COVID came in. And when you have a look at them and they outline them, again, you've got to wonder, how did he get the finance capacity at his age to do that? But they're in secondary locations. There's a few of them in Logan, and I know there's a couple of people out there in the blogosphere saying go buy in Logan, but Logan's been one of those areas that's had minimal capital growth. The challenge is that in areas where you get higher rental yield, and this gentleman's strategy is to get cash flow rather than capital growth, in areas with cash flow, you're not going to get as much capital growth. And even as you said a moment ago, the cash flow is not going to help you. See, my opinion is that you should be buying properties to help you buy more properties. We already know that it's going to be hard to do this. So I know the last property I bought, I didn't have to find any cash for because I had equity in my properties and I didn't have to show serviceability because my property portfolio gave me the serviceability. So I believe what you should be looking for is not short-term cash flow, but the ability in the medium term to buy future properties. So the intention really is to build a portfolio over time, but it's going to take a little bit longer in this environment, isn't it, Daniel?
It definitely is. And I've always been, I think, a student of your same principles and philosophies, Michael, and that is that particularly in the earlier phases of one's wealth journey and property investment journey, that capital growth really just unlocks so much more optionality in terms of what the future might hold. And yeah, I think a lot of people out there do underappreciate just the idea that often with cash flow, it does come at the expense of capital growth and what that might mean for them in the longer term when it does come to building the portfolio.
I think this gentleman quoted in the article, who has amassed a number of small secondary properties, would have been better to own one good property, and that would have maybe given him less cash flow in the short term, but it would have also given him capital growth, like you said, Daniel, but I also think better cash flow moving forward. In a lot of these areas, and it's not a judge of people, but in the lower socioeconomic areas where he did buy, and they were named like Indooroopilly and Logan and secondary places in New South Wales, the tenants haven't got the capacity to pay more rent in a lot of those areas, not just currently with our challenges in the economy, but in general, they're 1 or 2 weeks away from being broken. We see this all the time. So in areas where I know you like investing in, where you personally do invest, where a lot of our clients invest, the tenants are there for lifestyle choices, not just because they can't afford to buy a house. So there's demographics of local owners, but there's also the demographics of the tenants. So if this gentleman had bought in better locations, it's more likely that next year and the year after and the year after, as the value of his properties went up, he could also increase the rents and get the cash flow he's looking for, while it's unlikely he's going to, in an area where he's recently bought, be able to increase the rents because people's wages aren't going to go up in those locations.
Absolutely. Whilst it sounds so wonderful, owning a large number of properties, like anything, I suppose, that the devil's in the detail, and a quality asset that grows in value, and then the idea of earning a similar rental yield, albeit off the higher asset base, can be a very sensible strategy for many of our clients.
Now, what happens about owning your own home? Where does all that fit into the mix, Daniel?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that, Michael. And this is something that I actually mentioned to, if we just take it back to the beginning, that this client that first kind of brought the question to me, is just the idea of at least considering where one stands with respect to owning their principal place of residence. Because if we do appreciate that there is a debt ceiling and people do have an opportunity cost with taking on any debt, I was just very wanting this client to be careful going too hard too soon on their investment journey before having purchased their home. Because so many times I've seen clients come to me wanting to buy a home only to realize that the investment property or investment properties they've purchased sooner are now preventing them from really buying the home that they ultimately want. This is where I guess the strategy is so important.
What I'm hearing, though, is that strategy then of rent vesting that a lot of people have. In other words, I'll buy where I can afford, I'll rent where I can't afford but enjoy living, and in a couple of years down the track, I'm going to buy my home. No, it doesn't work that way. If you bought 1 or 2 investment properties, you're probably going to be maxed out with your serviceability. So it's actually a longer term strategy you have to put in place if you're going to be rent vesting. Is that what you're getting at?
Absolutely. And let's face it, property is a long-term investment. The way people can lose money, I suppose, through the rent vesting strategy is if they've just bought 1 or 2 investment properties only to then realize that they have to sell them too soon in order to buy their home. and they haven't yet had enough time in the market and maybe experienced a cycle or two to really appreciate the full benefit of their investment. And going in, going out with all the transaction costs involved, it doesn't quite work. So, yeah, just the foresight of when the home might be important for a particular client, I think is a real worthy consideration. And just noting that with so many younger clients, as soon as maybe they enter into a relationship or have children, their thinking on these matters can change quite abruptly and in a significant way. Yeah, definitely worth being mindful of before just jumping in too soon, or just being conscious of the fact at the outset that the strategy might, to your point, Michael, need to be a longer term one, if that's the one that makes sense.
Sure. Well, as you know, at Metropole, before we even start looking at properties, we put together a strategic property plan, which involves understanding what your aims are. Are you going to stop working for a year or two to have a baby? Are you planning to buy a home? Are you planning to take a year off overseas? And all those factors have to be taken into account. It's important to plan ahead. By the way, it was always important to do that even before this NCCP, but it's actually, you've got no choice at the moment. They're actually forcing us to become good money managers. And that's one of the problems a lot of Australians have got. They're not financially fluent. They're not good money managers. So there is some good in this. It's preventing people taking on too much debt. But as you said, I think we could argue maybe they've gone a little bit overboard and they're being a little bit cautious. So for those people who are wondering at the moment, are the banks still interested in lending? Are they keen to get new business?
Absolutely. We were just having a look at our conversion ratio, for example, only yesterday, and I think something like 95% of our loan applications have been approved. So, there's no question that the banks are open and still lending for the right client, but I suppose it just really helps to understand what a quality application looks like and doing your best to kind of tailor the candidacy of your application to what the banks will ultimately readily accept.
Sure. And it helps to have a smart finance strategist on your side. So in the show notes, there's going to be a link to your site, Long Property, as well as to that article, which I think is worth reading, even though you've heard us discuss it. So the bottom line, I guess, is that we all have a debt ceiling. Now, that'll change over time, but it's going to limit what you can buy. So buy carefully, buy cautiously. If you can only buy 3 properties or 2 properties or a dollar value of properties, own the best ones you can. And in my mind, that means properties that are going to outperform with regard to capital growth. And in turn, you'll get cash flow. Capital growth is what's going to get you out of the rat race, but clearly you need cash flow to service your debts and keep you in the game. So, Daniel, thank you very much. And I look forward to reading your next blog because you always come up with some great insights.
Well, the bar's been set pretty high, 10,000 readers on the first one, so I think I've got some work to do.
No. In the first day.
It's
gone much better than that. Well done.
Very good.
Thank you. In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. I'm actually going to share a bit about success and how I thought, and maybe I'll let you peek behind the curtains a bit about what's happened in my life. But before I do that, just following on my conversation with Daniel Gold, I just wanted to explain that while you may not be able to buy 50 properties, there's a number of factors that have changed my view on the property markets moving forward over the next year or two. You've probably already read it in my blogs or heard it in this podcast. There have been a number of game changers, and 2021, 2022 is going to be a great year for some property investors. However, there's still going to be lots of challenges. There's still going to be lots of headwinds. So to secure your financial future, you're going to need more than just a property strategist. In my mind, you're going to need much more than a buyer's agent. And that's why I'd invite you to have a chat with my team at Metropole, because we offer a 360-degree holistic approach to ensure you grow, protect, and pass on your wealth. Now, we don't sell property, which means we don't have the vested interest to tell you to buy here or buy that. What we do is provide a customized solution to meet your specific needs, but we use a time-tested framework for acquiring wealth. We help beginning investors buy their first property. So even if you're just starting on your journey, have a chat. We help experienced investors add to their portfolio. And We definitely look after quite a number of sophisticated investors, and we help them manufacture capital growth by being property developers. We've, of course, got wealth advisory, property management, renovations, whole financial planning. So we've got a whole group of services to help you in a holistic approach. Go to metropole.com.au, find out about what we do. I'd love to be part of your wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to talk to you a bit about success, your success, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about the way I think about success. Now, you probably started this year with some great ideas, some great plans, like a lot of people did, and then all of a sudden, COVID came and life threw some unusual, let's call them curveballs at you. So, how do you measure your success at unusual times like this? What are your rules of success? If you're like most people, you've got some rules, either in your head or maybe you've even got them written down as goals. Now, I remember many, many years ago, 30-odd years ago, went on a retreat on the Sunshine Coast, and I set plans for the next stage of my life and how I was going to build the Metropole group of companies to what they are today. At the time, I pictured what I'd needed to do to become Australia's leading expert in wealth creation through property. I set myself some audacious goals. I remember I made a list. I wanted to become a published author. Remember, this was 30 years ago. It was before I'd written my first of my 9 books. I wanted to have offices of Metropole in 3 big capital cities. Remember, at that time, Pam and I were just working from our home office. I wanted to have 100,000 subscribers to my newsletter database. At that time, I didn't even have a newsletter. I wanted to be in the media. This was before I had regular segments on the radio and TV and podcasts and blogs and all that. I set myself a whole heap of criteria to measure my success. But as my business grew, I had doubts about my success because I didn't fill all those criteria straight away. At times, I didn't feel the success I should be feeling for the levels of achievement that I'd already achieved along the way. At times, I felt doubt. I felt fear. I felt a little bit insecure. Can you relate to this? But then, again, this was many years ago, my business coach at the time asked me to do an audit of my own personal rules of success, and they were exceedingly high. I couldn't go from being an unknown in the real estate community to being the most respected expert straight away. Sure, I'm there now, but that was well over 20 years after that. I couldn't build a database of hundreds of thousands of subscribers in a few years, but I've achieved much more than that now. I couldn't write 8 books, which was my goal at the time, and being in the media straight away. I've written 9 books, and I've now got my own little media company, but I couldn't achieve that straight away. However, what I'm trying to say is, at the time, my audacious goals were unrealistic for me. But the big challenge I had was the word I used, and. The word and to connect my goals. I had to achieve this and that, and that. What that meant was that if any of my goals weren't achieved, as unrealistic as some of those goals were, I didn't feel a success. So the big breakthrough I had, and I'd like to share that with you today, was that I changed my rules of success. The first thing I did was take away the word and. It became or. I was able to feel proud or feel successful if I achieved any of my goals. The next thing I did was set up a whole group of little rules of success rather than just aiming for the big final goal, which meant that any small victory I made along the way made me feel successful. So think about your journey in life, whether it's in property, in your business, in your personal life. What rules have you set for yourself to judge your success? Sometimes they're going to be clear. Sometimes they're going to be unconscious. So what are those crazy, silly, outrageous rules of success that you've set yourself that are causing you frustration? Take time to evaluate them, to reassess them, to reset them, and then make the coming future great. We're moving our way through this pandemic. We're moving our way through the recession. We're moving to the next stage of our economy. It's going to be a great year. We're living in the great country. It's up to you now to have a great week. Make it a great week. Well, I hope you got some benefit from today's show. Thanks for spending the time with me, and you've now understood a bit about what is realistic in building a property portfolio and a little bit more about how I think about success. If you found it useful, I'd really appreciate if you told somebody about the show. That's the way we grow our community to help more and more people develop financial freedom, financial independence, and more choices in life. And by the way, if you got benefit from the show, why not tell the world by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to this. Of course, you can always just tell the world by using the share button on the podcast app. If you want to catch up with me in the meantime between my regular shows, just look out for Michael Yardney on social media, and I look forward to being back with you again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?